Our first speaker this afternoon will be Mr. Casey Knott. He is a doctoral student in the program of Medieval and Byzantine Studies here at the Catholic University of America. His dissertation is entitled Public Ascetic Performance in Constantinople, Development and Remembrance from the Late 4th to Early 11th Centuries. Let's welcome him.
Well, thank you very much, Carl, and thank you all for your kind attention. In the late 10th century, St. Simeon the New Theologian, then the controversial abbot of St. Mamas Monastery in Constantinople, penned a response to one of his spiritual children who posed a rather thorny, though timely question. Is it admissible, the child asked, to confess one's sins to monks who do not hold the priestly rank? Over some 429 lines of text, more public treatise than personal epistle, Simeon responded that yes, it was not only admissible for one to confess one's sins to unordained monks, but perhaps even preferable to do so. We might understand Simeon's seemingly unorthodox response, he was himself a holder of the monastic or of the priestly rank after all, as a symptom of the saint's staunchly individualized approach towards sanctity. Indeed, Simeon's works display a distinctly ambivalent stance toward the trappings of ecclesial rank and the current models of monastic formation. While Simeon certainly operated in a Constantinopolitan ascetic milieu that was heavily informed by normative hierarchies and patterns of monastic behavior, he championed what Alexander Kazhdan described as an atomized approach to ascetic progression, an approach which was ultimately aimed at the personal acquirement of dispassion under the guidance of a spiritual father. Such spiritual fathers, regardless of their priestly or monastic rank, were for Simeon the true friends of God, expert spiritual physicians who might act as mediators between the souls of their own spiritual children and the Godhead, before whom all souls would stand, quote, naked and trembling. Yet within the context of his epistolary response, Simeon makes a more specific argument regarding the historical development of both priestly and monastic authority. Ranging from the earliest Israelite priesthood through the patristic period and even up to his own day, the saint traced the historical ebb and flow of priestly exousia over the binding and loosing of sins. He argued that such authority is a revocable grace, which successive generations of priests had deprived themselves of through pride and worldly corruption. When Simeon reached his own time within this historical schema, he declared that, quote, the priests were rendered useless and have become like the people, just as the Lord said. In fact, by not reproving, not reining in, and not repulsing, but instead excusing and covering up their own passions, the priests became worse than the laity, and in turn, the laity worse than the priests. Yet some of the laity were proven to be better than the priests. Such men shine forth like blazing coals in the lightless gloom surrounding them, and now merely the pretense and the vesture of priesthood is left among them, because the grace of the Holy Spirit passed on to monks. Grace of the Holy Spirit passed on to monks and is being made known through miraculous signs, because through their actions, monks pursued the lifestyle of the apostles. But even here, once again, the devil performed his familiar routine. After seeing that the monks were on exalted display as new disciples of Christ in the world once again, and that they shone in their mode of life and their wonders, the devil integrated false brothers, his own pawns among them. And as these false brothers were increased little by little, the monks were also rendered useless, as you are able to see, and have become altogether false monks, end quote. As can be seen from this stark appraisal, Simeon took a rather dim view of the spiritual worth and authority of his contemporaries within the priestly and monastic hierarchies. In my time today, I would like to unpack this late reflection against the backdrop of several important trends and tensions which developed amid the ascetic cultures of 10th century Constantinople. I stress cultures in the plural because in many ways, the 10th century was a period of diversity for the development of organized and increasingly regulated monastic life, as well as for more unaffiliated modes of ascetic performance within the imperial queen of cities. Amid the competitive ascetic climate of 10th century Constantinople, within its monasteries, its aristocratic homes, and its porticoed streets, we're able to witness the ever-negotiated cultural boundaries between more normative modes of ascetic praxis and the more challenging performances which manifested in reaction to them. At these points of cultural tension, we are confronted by a highly vocal Ascetic milieu whose spiritual preoccupations and controversial hagiographical heroes were ideologically enmeshed with Simeon's late 10th century critique of a spiritually bereft generation of pretentious clerics, a growing majority of false monks, and an elect group of true monks and laymen whose wondrous displays were the sure signs of the apostolic bios come again. In order to understand this distinctly Constantinopolitan ascetic milieu and its development throughout the 10th century, we must first examine the larger monastic context which influenced it and to which it reacted. For the monasteries of Constantinople, the first decades of the century still reverberated with the developing memory of a distinctly monastic victory over iconoclasm in 843. Increasingly situated at the very crux of this memorialized victory were the monks of Studios Monastery in Constantinople, whose vigorous abbot Theodore had been a staunch defender of icon veneration. Through a voluminous corpus of epistles and polemical discourses, the student and his monks endeavored to frame the iconoclastic struggle as a conflict between heretical imperial and clerical authorities and the steadfast Orthodox monks who were persecuted as martyrs and confessors. Perhaps the most visual example of such Studite memorial framing comes to us in the form of the mid-9th century Kludov Psalter, which depicts an unkempt John the Grammarian, the final iconoclastic patriarch, in the process of painting over an icon of Christ, an action which is mirrored by the wicked Roman soldier who offers Christ vinegar to drink in the crucifixion scene above. While the Psalter, which follows the liturgical program of Hagia Sophia, cannot be reliably linked to the flourishing Studite scriptoria, its clear visual argumentation is evidence of a growing attitude of mind amongst the exuberant iconodal victors in the immediate aftermath of what the Synodicon of Orthodoxy remembered as, quote, our extraordinary winter, end quote. This attitude continued to intensify into the early 10th century, with the constructed memory of Studite resistance increasingly taking center stage. This was a post-iconoclastic climate in which, in the words of the late Ihor Savchenko, quote, only the victors were left to celebrate their own heroes, end quote. We're able to witness some portion of this decades-long process of commemorating Studite monks as the architects of a joyous iconodal spring in two shifting historical accounts of the events surrounding the so-called triumph of orthodoxy. The first, contained within the widely circulated compendium of conciliar accounts known as the Synetikon Vetus, and written sometime in the late 9th century, described the Council of 843 as a simple accord between the courtiers of the iconodal Empress Theodora and the ecclesiastical hierarchy, an accord which resulted in the swift approval of the new iconodal patriarch Methodius. The second account, written by the historian Genesios sometime during the 10th century reign of Constantine Porphyrogenitos, recounted a far more colorful scenario. Genesios tells us that a group of Studite monks sought out an alien imperial official named Manuel and promised to heal him if he would convince Theodora to reinstate the veneration of icons. The empress, we are told, acquiesced to Manuel's intervention and sought out the patriarch Methodios, a true confessor who, quote, still bore the scars of persecution upon his body. These enterprising Studites, Genesius continues, now backed by a coalition of monks from the holy mountains of Ida, Athos, Olympos, and Caminas, went on to take pride of place within the processions that marked the first feast of orthodoxy. Beginning perhaps with the 1959 publication of Julien Leroy's Le Réforme Studite, the historicity of this increasingly official memory of a hard-fought Studite victory has been wisely problematized, especially in the recent work of Leslie Brubaker and John Halden. Indeed, it is now generally agreed that the Studite voices loom large within our source base by self-perpetuating design. While it would be a step too far to claim that the powerful scriptoria of the Studite monasteries were engaged in the propagandistic rewriting of their own place in the history of Byzantine iconoclasm, it is safe to say that their systematic efforts to commemorate their own heroic forebears exerted a profound influence upon the construction of what Pierre Nora might describe as a lieu de mémoire. The burgeoning locus of shared cultural memory allows us to establish what generations of 10th century monks in Constantinople had been taught to remember about the end of iconoclasm. In the summation of Rosemary Morris, they believed that the hegumenos Theodore and his Studite monks had been among the greatest iconodal heroes, and that their monastic organization, laid out in Theodore's still circulating works, and visible within the monasteries under his lingering influence, constituted the correct ordering of the monastic life. Theodore's monastic successors, as we shall see, continued to flourish in the light still emanating from his meticulously burnished halo. The specter of Studite influence, as obscuring as it may appear to many modern scholars, came to profoundly shape the contours of normative monastic organization in the first half of the 10th century. Theodore the Studite's glowing reputation may well have been germinated through the memory of his heroic resistance to iconoclasm, but it matured and spread roots due to his role as a champion of the Cenobitic lifestyle. Indeed, a large number of Theodore's extant works were chiefly concerned with the practical regulation of a growing confederation of monasteries. Theodore's final testament, which he dictated to his chosen successor Naucratius shortly before his death in 826, represents one of the earliest 9th century examples of a growing corpus of monastic typica, an amorphous body of foundational and regulatory documents which represented the organizational ideals of monastic founders for their successors. For his own successors, Theodore's testament declared that the monastic life, quote, must be ordered according to the ascetic rules of holy Basil the Great, and not by half measures, so that some in one place chose some rules and let others go. For one cannot choose to lead this life lawfully in some other fashion without the three revealed orders of the divine ladder. In this way, Theodore stressed a return to the ideals of the koinobion, a tried and tested communal structure whose particulars had been laid out in the teaching of Basil the Great, John Climacus, Dorotheus of Gaza, and Barsanuphius and John. For Theodore, strict adherence to these Cenobitic norms represented the desirable resurgence of the old way of life, whose pillars of ascetic progression included obedience to communal hierarchy, the pursuit of manual labor, and the performance of the divine liturgy. Theodore's staunchly Cenobitic vision, couched in the customary language of a return to patristic values, seems to have exerted a rousing influence within the monasteries of 10th century Constantinople, and especially within the Byzantine, and within the Byzantine Empire writ large. These influences, which can be traced within the 10th century monastic typica, had led scholars such as John Thomas, Albert Deem, and Thomas Pott to speak of a concerted program of Studite reform. It is certainly true that the reverberating memory of Studite resistance and the patina of authority which it lent to Theodore's Cenobitic program combined to create a potent model for monks in 10th century Byzantium. Yet we know so little about how Cenobitic monasteries were organized in the time before Theodore that it would be incautious to paint this rather outsized Studite influence as totalizing. Further still, should we avoid the temptation to view Theodore's return to the old ways as comparable with the contemporary Western scene, a scene in which Benedict of Anianae was tasked with the top-down collation of various reguli benedicti and the royally sanctioned dispersal of the Benedictine model throughout the Carolingian realm. Although Studios Monastery enjoyed the support of several emperors, Theodore's Cenobitic vision did not spawn a discernible or royally sanctioned monastic order, nor did its admirers slavishly adhere to the regulations of the Studite koinobion. Oops. There we go. In fact, at the very apogee of Studite influence in Constantinople, we encounter a variety of approaches to the ascetic life. All of these point towards a broader trend which Alexander Kazhdan called atomization. This increasingly perceptible shift away from Cenobitic models and towards less communal, more personal expressions of ascetic praxis can be discerned most strikingly in two challenging hagiographical accounts, the life of St. Andrew the Fool and the life of St. Basil the Younger, composed between 945 and 960, both of which paved the way for the resurgence of a rather controversial ascetic type, namely that of the Byzantine Salos, or Holy Fool. From the late 7th century until the middle of the 10th, the Holy Fool type had all but disappeared from the pages of Byzantine hagiography. This was due in part to the nature of the performance of holy folly, a performance which required the ascetic to immerse himself within the city and to engage in a totalizing program of feigned insanity and provocative public scandal. Through this atomized performance, holy fools pursued a life of immersion rather than anachoresis, creating their own interior ascetic isolation within the crowded urban milieu. The most classic example of this type was Simeon of Emesa, the central figure of a life composed by Leontius of Neapolis in the 640s. Leontius, drawing upon the model of Diogenes the Cynic, portrayed the saintly protagonist as a figure who scandalized his Emesian audience by dragging a dead dog through the city's gates, roaming its streets and bathhouses naked, cavorting with prostitutes, and even defecating in public before outraged onlookers, who saw the saint as nothing more than a possessed madman. Simeon's seemingly sinful acts, Leontius tells us, were meant to allow the performing fool to maintain a dispassionate state while also achieving the ascetic virtue of humility and the shunning of vainglory. In this way, the Holy Fool's performance was a delicate game, which both necessitated and expected an audience that was at least partially in on the performative conceit. To quote Sergei Ivanov, extravagant conduct may qualify as holy foolery only if those who watch it assume that what lies beneath it is saintly and high morality, even pious intent, end quote. But how was an audience to discern between a true Salos and a true madman? The potent, if hazardous, influence of Simeon of Emesa brought this question to the fore and led to a stark division of opinions. For John Climacus, writing in the early 7th century, holy fools like Simeon of Emesa, quote, the practitioner of purity who stripped off his own clothes and wandered around the city dispassionately, were not concerned by human stumbling, since they have received the power to bring assurance to everyone invisibly through prayer. The one who has care for human stumbling has indicated his deficiency in prayer, for wherever God is ready for a request, we are able to achieve all things. Wish more to grieve men than to grieve God, for he rejoices when he sees us running towards dishonor, in order that we may utterly destroy vain opinion, end quote. For Climacus, the outwardly shameful provocations of the holy fool were an exercise in banishing pride and vainglory. Any negative reactions that these scandals received from the observer were nothing more than the stumbling of those who were too deficient in prayer and discernment to realize the true sanctity beneath the fool's performance. In this way, Climacus divorced the dispassionate fool from the external results of his actions and rested upon the Pauline maxim that, quote, the wisdom of this world is foolishness in God's sight. Of course, not everyone agreed with this bold understanding of the Holy Fool's performance. Controversy arose primarily from the fact that the model of the Holy Fool had, by the late 7th century, broken out of the pages of hagiography, inspiring real flesh and blood holy fools in cities across the Mediterranean. The emergence of these real-world imitators did not escape the notice of the ecclesiastical authorities. The ascetic pretense of insanity was flatly condemned at the council in Trullo in 692, as were the scandalous actions which accompanied such a guise. In direct reference to feigned insanity, Canon 60 of the council declared that, quote, it has seemed good by every means to censure those who pretend to be possessed by a demon, and who, in a feigned manner, adapt their appearance to the wickedness of those mannerisms, and to subject them to the same punishments to which those who are truly possessed by demons would justly be subjected. The question of discernment had been decided. The very appearance of this canon suggests that the discerning between a true Salos and a true demoniac was deemed to be impossible by church authorities. Real holy fools, those who had been inspired to real action by the bold literary portrayal of Simeon of Emesa and the theological justification of John Climacus, represented too great a threat to the social order and the moral fabric of the city. While this official condemnation sapped the energy from the inscrutable performance of real-world holy fools, by the latter half of the 10th century, and among a very specific Constantinopolitan Ascetic milieu, the holy fool type resurfaced in an adapted and highly literary form. The literary nature of the Salos was essential to its survival. Sergei Ivanov has noted that, quote, the most famous holy fools in Byzantium, who are mentioned in all Synaxaria, barely existed in reality. They are literary fictions, end quote. This is certainly true of the aforementioned vitae of Andrew the Fool and Basil the Younger. Both of these hagiographical works were elaborately constructed in order to protect their foolish protagonists from the ecclesiastical censure that still stained the holy fool type. In the case of St. Andrew the Fool, this entailed the creation of a historical novel of sorts, which was purported by its author, supposedly the 6th century patriarch Epiphanios, to be both composed and set in the heroic saintly age of the 5th century. Yet several features, including a equation of Andrew's own program of holy folly with the performance of, quote, Simeon of old, an anachronistic reference to Simeon of Emesa, betray the text as a production of the mid-940s or 950s. The author of the Life of St. Basil the Younger, a spiritual child known only as Gregory, was bolder in his literary creation. Unlike Andrew, whose somewhat inconsistent 5th century setting shielded him from conciliar aspersions, Basil the Younger is portrayed as a figure firmly grounded in the historical reality of the 10th century, a figure who encountered the Emperor Romanus I and predicted the revolt of Constantine Ducas in 913 and the invasions of the Rus and the Magyars in 941 and 943, respectively. However, in spite of this firm historical grounding, we know nothing of Basil the Younger beyond his immediate vita. The saint is not mentioned in the Synaxaria of Constantinople, and the supposed resting place of his remains, a monastery that the author calls Cartophylax, is unknown outside of the immediate text. The author of the Life of St. Basil the Younger provides us with one reason for the obscurity of the holy man, namely that the saint, quote, did not reveal his holy nature to everyone equally, but did this sparingly and among a few disciples and various persons whom he clearly loved and honored more than others, and whom he judged able to discern. Most of his utterances among the general public were made enigmatically and with feigned folly, though he was the pinnacle of wisdom and of discernment. We might rightly ask what the purpose would have been in presenting these two literary saints, new representatives of a maligned form of atomized ascetic performance, to a 10th century audience whose expectations of normative saintly behavior were consistently Cenobitic. Indeed, unlike the vast majority of hagiographical heroes after iconoclasm, neither Andrew nor Basil were ordained or belonged to any monastic community. Instead, both saints were portrayed as strangers to the hierarchies of the imperial city. Both were brought to Constantinople against their will. Andrew as the enslaved bodyguard of a nobleman named Theognostos, and Basil as a suspected spy. Upon entering the Queen of Cities, both saints came to occupy spaces that were outside the purview of ecclesial and monastic authorities. For Andrew, this entailed immersion within the spiritual and literal filth of the streets and fora of the capital, which were portrayed as a crucible of the saint's veiled dispassion. Basil, on the other hand, was hosted in the oikoi, the households, of aristocratic lay patrons, who made up the core of his growing body of spiritual children. Yet it's precisely this unaffiliated outsider stance that grants these saints of dubious historicity with their most potent cultural agency. Andrew, as the apostle of the streets, and Basil, as the apostle of the aristocratic oikos, stand outside of ecclesial and monastic hierarchies, a position which allows them to voice pointed critiques of normative modes of spiritual authority. This anti-ecclesial stance is portrayed through a series of didactic visions, which both Andrew and Basil share with their young disciples. For Epiphanius, the disciple of Andrew, this included a lurid vision of demons at work during the performance of the divine liturgy, and the discernment of several wicked deacons and monks whose official garb does little to hide their interior pride and material greed. Basil's own spiritual child, Gregory, is granted two protracted visions of the afterlife, which bear the hallmarks of apocalyptic exegesis. The first of these visions concerns an apocryphal account of the so-called toll houses of the air, through which Basil's recently deceased servant, Theodora, must pass while being searched for unconfessed sins. Theodora, a scrupulously virtuous woman who confessed her every moral failing to the unordained Basil, is saved from eternal damnation by the mediation of the saint on her behalf, and therefore dwells for eternity in the paradisal oikos which Christ has set aside for Basil and his cadre of devoted disciples. The second vision, which Basil grants Gregory, is a preview of the Last Judgment, during which Gregory witnesses a dazzling flock of holy fools marching joyously into heaven, while an exceedingly great multitude of bishops, deacons, subdeacons, readers, and cantors are condemned to eternal damnation. The monastic sphere fares no better here. Gregory's angelic guide assures him that, quote, in the consummation of the ages, the whole generation of monks has proceeded to perdition, apart from a few who have clearly adored to undertake spiritual hardship, pain, and toil. These didactic visions, replete with criticisms of the clerics and monks of the 10th century, and concerned with the discernment and confession of sins and the championing of atomized relationships between holy fools and their spiritual children, ought to immediately remind us of the stark appraisal of Simeon the New Theologian, with which we began our examination today. We recall Simeon's description of a spiritually bankrupt generation of priests, bereft of the grace-given exousia over the binding and loosing of sins, and clinging to the mere pretense of their clerical rank, a generation of monks winnowed away by the devil's customary work, an elect group of true monks and laymen whose apostolic conduct pierced through the gloom and was confirmed by miraculous signs. Simeon's critique displays immediate ideological parallels with the attitudes portrayed in the vitae of the holy fools Andrew and Basil, but such similarities only deepen with a brief examination of Simeon's own late 10th century ascetic career. It is tantalizing to envision a young Simeon, then an aristocratic youth named George, reading the miraculous deeds and visions of the holy fools Andrew and Basil, who plied their performances in the very streets and homes of his own adopted city. Born in 949, Simeon would have come of age immediately after the composition of these two vitae, but we have no firm evidence of his familiarity with them. What we do know is that Simeon's own spiritual father, an unordained monk of Studios Monastery named Simeon Eulabes, quote, used to feign affection, partially wishing to overshadow the treasure of his dispassion, for he used to flee glory and praise of men as if it were a serpent biting his heel, and partly by means of this bait to secretly drag up from the depths of destruction and ransom for death some, and if possible, all who lie below, end quote. H.G.M. Turner has persuasively argued that it was Simeon the New Theologian's unilateral canonization of a condemned holy fool that led to his famed conflicts with the Synkelos Stephen of Nicomedia. Yet Simeon's reception of the practice of holy folly went further than the mere honoring of a sometimes holy fool turned spiritual father. Within the confines of St. Mamas, Simeon came to prescribe the practice of holy folly as a penance and tool of monastic self-formation. The life of Simeon the New Theologian, written by Nikitas Stitatos in the late 11th century, bears vivid witness to the saint's integration of this most atomized of ascetic performances within the confines of a more traditional and Studite-inspired koinobion. One of the most striking examples of this practice of integration concerned a certain monk named Hierotheos, who had formerly been a bishop in the western regions before he accidentally killed one of his servants and fled to Constantinople, entering Simeon's monastery of St. Mamas. As a penance for his sin, Nicetas tells us that, quote, Simeon prescribed that Hierotheos be placed on top some mules and that he be dragged along by another monk as far as Xerolophos, and that the one dragging him should speak in this way. If anyone has been damaged in his wits, he will submit to a triumph such as this. So with Hierotheos having been loaded with the empty vessels, as the one dragging the mule was saying the things which had been prescribed in a loud voice, the wondrous Hierotheos, pouring forth with words and streams of tears, was crying out along with him, end quote. In many ways, this unique tableau of monastic instruction, one of many laid out in the Vita, represents a culmination of the elements of ascetic culture that we have explored thus far. Simeon's formative years were spent amid an ascetic milieu that was divided between the influential norms of the Studite koinobion and the charismatic images of more atomized ascetic performances of holy fools like Andrew, Basil, and Simeon Eulabes. Simeon ultimately came to straddle these two expressions of the ascetic ideal by envisioning the koinobion as a workshop of monastic self-formation. As the director of such a workshop, Simeon had at his disposal the normative canobitic emphases on obedience, manual labor, and liturgical prayer, but he also augmented these more traditional monastic values by prescribing, like an expert spiritual physician, more challenging performances. The practice of holy folly, which had adapted in the face of clerical condemnation, meshed perfectly with Simeon's dim appraisal of perceived clerical and monastic authority. For Simeon, the true authorities, those who were fit to bind and loose the sins of their flock, were the elect spiritual fathers. This persistent minority did not rest upon the pretense of priestly or monastic titles, but actively pursued the wondrous life of the apostles and were able, through ascetic toil, to induce within themselves and their disciples the virtue of penthos, a sorrowful compunction which was marked by the gift of tears and which might ultimately lead to complete dispassion. Like John Climacus, Andrew, Basil, and Simeon Eulabes before him, Simeon the new theologian came to believe that the Holy Fool, because of his staunchly unaffiliated position, represented the pinnacle of such dispassion and, therefore, the ideal model of the true spiritual father and the true friend of God. Thank you all very much.